Hi everyone, Joseph Koensgen here. Welcome back to my art studio. Today I want to show you how I paint the blue jay that's in the painting I've got on the easel behind me here. I'll show you the feather details, the different shades of blue that I'm going to mix, and my overall process of how I bring the bird to life in my painting. If you'd like to watch a video on how I painted the frosty branches for the background, I'll leave a link in the description below. So let me show you the colors and the brushes that I'm using, and then I can get started. For my paints, I've got Mars Black, Titanium White, Payne's Gray, Ultramarine Blue, Phthalo Blue, and Alizarin Crimson. And for my brushes, I'm just using a round number 2 and a round number 1. Now where I left off in my last video, I had left a gap in the branches for the blue jay. So I'll quickly show you what I do when I want to be able to move it around and play around with the placement a little bit. I'll just do a rough sketch. Not too much detail, just enough to get the shape right, along with the feather details, and just working out all the proportions. Then I'll take a piece of tracing paper and trace it out. Just getting the basic lines and shapes. Some of those feather details and any details in the structure that I think I might need. Then I can flip it over and do the outlines on the other side so that when I transfer it onto the painting, it's going to be facing the right way. Then I can take my tracing and put it on my painting. Start moving it around a little bit to try out different spots. And a lot of the time, I'm only moving it around just a tiny bit. I like doing this because I can experiment with different positions and in not too much time, figure out a good spot that feels right for the painting. Then I can just use my finger to press on the tracing paper and transfer those pencil lines onto the painting. If you'd like to see more about how I plan out and put together my compositions, let me know in the comments and I can make a video about that in the future. Okay, then I can take off my tracing paper, and now I've got my outline for the blue jay and I'm ready to start painting. I can start by blocking in, so I'll mix up a mid-range value blue color, starting with my ultramarine and some white, a touch of the alizarin crimson, and a touch of the black. I want a soft blue that has a slight purple tint to it. Then with my round number 2 brush, I can take this blue color and start blocking in. This color will be for the head and the top part of the back. And I'll mention right now at the beginning here that this blue jay took me around 10 to 12 hours to paint. There's a fair amount of feather details and some subtle light and shadow that in the end is going to look really great for this painting. So I'll just continue on blocking in, going over these parts again with a second layer to make sure that that color is nice and solid and without a lot of transparency. For blocking in the dark parts, I'll take some of my Mars Black, thin it out just a little bit, then a touch of my previous blue color to lighten it a bit. Then I can block in all these dark spots. This black stripe that's on the side of the head. And then I can fill out the eye. And then the lower half of the beak. As well as some of those dark spots that are around the beak, just a little bit up onto the crown. And then as well for this dark part that's just in front of the eye. This will be for the top half of the beak, so I'll take some of that black, a little bit more of that blue. And I'm not being really precise with the block in. I'm just wanting to get a good color base for the details that I'll be putting on later. Then I can take a bit of my Mars Black, thin that out a bit of my white, and a touch of that previous blue color. I want to make a lighter mid-range value gray that will be for the part that's on the side of the face and around the eye. And I'll just use this color to go around the beak and eventually up around the eye. I really like starting out this way, using these mid-range values as my base layer. It makes it easy to build up the highlights and the shadows on either side of these colors. And I can darken this color a little bit more black, and just a tiny bit more of that blue for some color harmony. Now switching to my round number 1 brush, I can start detailing the feathers on the side of the face. Slowly building up these darker shadow areas and these tiny little breaks between the feathers. Darkening this area around the beak and below where there would be a bit of a deeper shadow. And then just a little bit around the eye. And this darker line that goes between the eye and the black stripe. Some above the eye and just around that dark spot. And some around the edges of this gray area between the blue and the gray. And here I can make some fine lines for these very small shadows between the feathers. And I'm paying close attention to the shape and the direction of them, following that structure of the blue jay's head, and again on the black stripe just to help soften that edge. Then I can darken that color a bit more, really start to deepen some of those shadows around the edges of these black parts. This is where I can get even a bit more detailed with these shadow areas. Looking at that feather structure and painting in all those very fine lines. I don't want to do too much of this, just in a few places where it's the darkest, and I can get a bit of a range of shadows, some lighter and some darker. Now I can mix a lighter gray with my previous mixture, and some white, and a bit of ultramarine blue. And now I can go in here and start to add these highlight details. I am slowing down here just a little bit to be more precise with my brush. Following those shadow lines I had just put in there. Again, paying attention to the structure and the direction of the feathers, slowly bringing out these lighter areas, and getting into the really fine details up closer to the beak, and a little bit down the edge of that black stripe towards the bottom. Then a highlight on the edge under the beak to give it a bit of a glow and the look of it being slightly backlit. Then above the eye, where I want to have these lighter feathers gently roll off into this darker area that's around the beak. Then I can come back with just titanium white for the brightest highlight. And I'm only putting this in the spots where it's getting the most light, mostly along the edges of where it meets the black stripe, and a few other spots where I want some details to stand out. Again, along this edge under the beak where it will look like some light is coming from behind the blue jay. And then above the eye, just a little bit in the top corner that will roll off into those shadows. I'll mix a bit of Payne's gray and Mars black together for a nice dark color. Then I can go and deepen all these shadow areas. The part around the beak, and then the eye. I really like this mixture of Payne's gray and black together. The Mars black can be a little bit flat, So I've found that adding a good amount of Payne's gray to it helps give it a bit more depth and adds a little bit more tone to those shadow areas where the Mars black might be a little bit too dull. And down onto the black stripe, darkening that shadow between these two colors. Now for the top part of the beak, with a darker gray with some blue in it, and just gently highlighting some of those edges. Then a very thin highlight of just titanium white to follow a little bit of that backlight. Now for the highlight in the eye, I'm using a mid-range gray, not putting very much on here at all. Then just some white for that little bright spot. For the blue parts, I'm going to mix a slightly darker shadow color, starting with my Ultramarine and a bit of white, some black and a touch of Alizarin crimson, maybe just a little bit more white. There we go, that looks good. And then, the same way I just did the gray and white part around the eye, I'll paint these blue parts in there, starting with a slightly darker shadow color, using that to build in that structure and shape, giving it some texture, and showing where some of the feathers might clump together, creating all these little shadows. And again, I really like to paint it this way, starting with that mid-range value and then adding shadows and highlights on top, because with just these two colors, I can already see a lot of the structure that I'm trying to build in here. So the look and the shape of these parts come together really quickly, and then later on with some of those finer details, I can build on top of this really good base and then bring it all together. I'll go with a slightly darker color next, some black, a bit of ultramarine blue, and a bit of crimson. I'm going to just darken some of these areas here along the edges, and up onto the back of the crest, where there's going to be a few darker feathers there. And then down along the back edge of this black stripe, just to soften that edge a little bit. I'll add a little bit more of my dark color to clean that up a bit, and just put a few on the back of the crest, darken a few of those feathers. For the highlight color, I'll lighten up one of my last blue mixtures, adding some more ultramarine, just to bring back a little bit of that saturation. Then I can paint a little bit of this highlight along the top edges of these shapes I made with my shadows. And it doesn't take much highlight to bring these shapes out, and as I get more towards the top edge of the crest here, I can start to put more highlight on where it's going to be getting a lot more light. That will also help give it a slight rounded look as I have my highlights get progressively brighter towards the top of the head. For this part on the back of the head, I'm going to do a little bit more of a gradient with some softer brush strokes. Starting with a bit of a lighter color on the edge, and then drawing that down into some of those shadows. And I'm going to show a bit of a shadow line right here, where there's just kind of a subtle break in the feathers. Okay, just a few more details for the blue jay's head. I'll just add some more of this blue in a few places, a little bit around the beak. I think that looks great. Now I can move down to the top part of the back. And this will be the same colors and process as the blue parts I just did for the head. But this will be a bit more of a gradient, and I'm going to really follow the shape and contour of this part of the back. I want it to look like it has this nice rounded shape, and I'm also going to add some subtle shadow areas in here that will give it a little bit of a layered look, while still keeping it within this overall gradient I'm trying to create here. I can darken that color to start deepening those shadows, again following that shape. And I don't have much paint on my brush here. I'm doing a bit of a dry brushing with softer brush strokes. This way I can gently build up those shadows without it getting too dark too quickly, where I would then have to dial it back with another layer of lighter colors. Okay, just a little bit more. A bit on some of those edges. And a few in some of those subtle shadow areas. Now for the highlight, and the same thing again, doing this a bit softer with not a lot of paint, building that highlight up in a few different layers, trying to get a nice gradient of light from the top of the back to the bottom. So I'll start with one layer, and then add more where it's supposed to be a bit brighter. And that's where working with a thin paint here can help me achieve that nice range of highlights with one single color, where I can bring out different light parts by simply putting more paint on in those specific areas. Now for the wing feathers, I want to mix a bit of a different color blue, so I'll start with my ultramarine and some white. Then I can grab my phthalo blue, which will give it a different hue and move it away from that slightly purple tinted blue that I had used for the head and the back. A touch more of the ultramarine, and I think that should be good. Then I can start to block in the wings with this blue, and you can see that it's a bit of a different hue than the previous blue that I had used, which will become more noticeable as I go on and add the highlights and shadows after this. I'm going to follow my pencil outlines here when I block in this color, leaving some gaps here and there instead of just going over the entire thing. Then I can see where each feather is supposed to be, making it a bit easier when I get into those finer details and all of those lines and shadows that separate each wing feather. I'm also going over each part with a second layer to make sure the color is nice and solid. I don't want this blue to have too much transparency, and the great thing with acrylics is that because they dry so quickly, you can go over things layer after layer without having to wait very long for it to dry. Okay, that's a good start for that blue. I can darken that color slightly and start detailing these wing feathers and all the lines that separate them. I've thinned my paint out just a little bit more than normal so that it flows off the brush a bit better. And I found that I can get nice straight lines by painting them in this quicker, more sweeping motion than by going slowly and trying to be really precise. Even with a fairly steady hand, I've noticed that my lines will be a little jagged if I go really slow. So these longer sweeping brush strokes can really help eliminate that. It takes some practice, but I really like how sharp those lines look when I do it this way. As well, I can start to darken the ends of the wing feathers. Each one has a fairly sharp gradient leading up to the white part at the tip of each feather. So I'll just use that to start building in these dark areas and some shadows, giving each one a bit more structure, and to start showing those details and the shape of each one. And the same with these lines on the other wing. starting to get a good base for all these shadows and feather details. Okay, now I can go a little bit darker with my Phthalo blue and my Ultramarine, a little bit of Mars black, and just a touch of white. Then I can go in and build on the color I just put in there, deepening those shadows and dark color that's at the end of the blue part of each one of these feathers. Going over some of these lines again, and just slowly increasing that contrast. And again, I'm doing these dark areas of the gradient in the same way I did the other blue parts above the wings. Some softer brush strokes with not a lot of paint, and then again over top of some of these lines. Some of this will be a bit repetitive as I go over these details again with darker and darker colors. But that buildup of shadow is going to work really well so that I can have my highlights roll off really naturally into the shadows. Onto the other wing. And this color is working really nicely. And with adding some more contrast here, I'm getting the difference in color that I wanted from the head and the back to the wings. It's not a huge shift in the hue, but there is a difference between the color of those feathers, and I really like how those two different blues go together. Okay, just a little bit more of this color along those lines to show that separation of feathers. And a bit more on some of those dark areas. I'll grab a little bit of Mars black and some Ultramarine and add that to my previous mixture for an even darker color. Maybe just a touch more of both of my blues. Then I can start to darken these even more. And this is the darkest I'll go with this color, so I'm just putting it right at the ends and along the center shaft of some of these feathers. And just a bit along some of the edges and lines. And then here where these feathers are a bit bunched together, I can darken that just a little bit more. And again, I don't need too much of this color. So I want to be careful not to overdo it. Just a little bit in the darkest places. And again on the left wing, doing roughly the same thing that I did on the other. And just getting into all of those small details. Now I'm just going to lighten that color up a little bit with some white and both of my blues. And I just want to soften some of these harsh edges that I had made on the gradient of these feathers. So some very light dry brushing over top of a few places. I found that this can help smooth out these rough spots and just make it look nice and realistic. For a highlight color, I'll take some white, my Phthalo blue, and some Ultramarine. I want a fairly strong blue here, so I'll add just a little bit more of those two. And I think that should be good. I'll put this highlight color in just the middle part of these feathers here. Not too much, but enough to make it look like there's a bit of a shine. I'm also doing my brush strokes in the direction that the little barbs that extend off the center shaft are pointing. It's a really subtle detail, but paying attention to the direction of each part of the feather structure will help make it feel real. Then onto the other side, and a little bit up onto these feathers here. with some of these only having a tiny little line of highlight on them. Now for the stripes on all these wing feathers, I'll grab some Mars Black and some Ultramarine and Phthalo Blue. And then just a touch of the white so it's not too dark, and I can use that as a good base. So I'll go in and start painting these stripes, and I am following my reference photo quite closely for this, so that I get all these stripes in just the right place. This is where the sharp point of my round number 1 is going to work really well, just getting all those nice fine lines and details. And the spacing of these stripes is pretty even, so I'm just making sure that they have the same distance between them. I'm just kind of judging it by eye and then just going back over them again just to deepen that color. And they aren't quite perfectly in line with each other, which I kind of like. It just helps break up that pattern a little bit, and you get a bit more of that separation between each feather. For these feathers that are closer together, the stripes are just these little lines showing on just the edges of these feathers. And these little stripes are a bit more staggered from how the wing is tucked in. And maybe I can just darken a couple more of those lines. Up on these smaller ones here, and already it's really starting to come together with these blue and black striped feathers. They're just so distinct for this bird, and that strong color and contrast really makes it stand out. Which is also why I chose it for this scene. I just love how much blue jays stand out on these frosty winter days. Then the same on the other wing. Again, watching my spacing and how much these stripes are staggered between the feathers. Darkening some of these lines, and then for the ones that are just showing on the edges, a few more small details and stripes. Now I've got my mixture of Payne's Gray and Mars Black, and I'm going to go in and darken some of these stripes. Some a bit more than others as I follow the patterns of the light and the gradient of the feathers. This also helps in bringing in a bit more contrast, making them even a little bit more bold and standing out in this scene. For the white parts at the end of the feathers, I'm starting with a mixture of titanium white and a small amount of Mars Black, just as a base so the bright white highlight will stand out on top of this. And I'll just fill in all these white spots with this color, establishing the shape at the end of each feather. These also give the blue jay that really striking look. The high contrast of the black and blue with these large white spots at the end. I'm also leaving little gaps between them to show some of that background color. It will just create a little bit of separation and act as a slight shadow between each one. Now I've got just titanium white, and I can paint on top of a few of these as the brightest highlight. And I'm going to highlight mostly the ones in the middle and a little bit on the sides to help emphasize that rounded look. For the ends of the primary feathers that are sticking out here, this is the same color as the wings, but with a lot less blue in it, so it's not quite as saturated. I can establish the shape and where the ends of each of the feathers are, and start to block that in. I can lighten that up a little bit and fill in the rest of these shapes. This part of the wing doesn't have as much contrast, so I'll keep it a little bit more muted. Then I'll go over it again, make sure that color is nice and solid. Then a little bit lighter still, and I can just go around the edges to highlight the tips of these feathers. And a bit lighter again, just in a few places here. And then using this color to bring it up into the rest of the wing. I decided to do a bit of a darker shadow just under these brighter wing feathers, just to push them down a little bit more and show a bit of space between them. For the part of the belly that we see on the sides here, I'll start by painting in some shadows. The color for this is some gray with a small amount of ultramarine blue. I'll paint in a shadow for under the wing and for a few of these breaks in the feathers on both sides. I can lighten that up and fill in the rest of these feathers. And on the other side as well, where it's just a little bit of those feathers showing. Then a bit of a darker color to deepen these shadows, just under the wing again, and a couple spots down at the bottom. Now for the highlight. This isn't the brightest one just yet. It's a bit of a light gray that I can use to paint in these initial details. And I want to keep these a bit wispy looking. Like it's just ever so slightly puffing out its feathers, like how they do in the winter when it's cold. So I'll keep my brushwork nice and light with some longer brush strokes, especially here where I can overlap these highlights onto the shadows. That's a small detail that will help make it look like the feathers aren't so tightly together against its body. Now for just titanium white as the brightest highlight. Just a bit on these high spots, and a tiny bit along the edges. Something I noticed, it feels like there's too harsh of a line between these two parts, so I want to bring a bit of a darker color down into the wings to soften that edge. So I'll take some ultramarine and black, a touch of white and alizarin crimson, maybe just a bit more of those colors. Then I can go in along the edge here and just overlap some of this color into both parts of the blue jay. Slowly building it up so it doesn't get too dark. Bring this up a little bit into those subtle shadow areas so that it all matches with the darker color I've added in here. A little bit more with some very soft brushwork. And I like that much better. It feels like those two parts are a lot more together now. Okay, that's looking great. I'm really happy with how this blue jay is coming along. And now I can move on to the tail. It's going to be the same colors and process that I did for the wings. So I'll start by blocking in that blue color. It won't be quite as complicated as the wings were. Just some of these longer feathers and a few tucked in underneath along the sides. So I'm going to follow that shape so that I can still see a bit of the structure that I had made with my pencil lines. Then for the white bits at the end here, I can block those in quickly. And I didn't like how high up that white part was, so I'll grab some blue and bring that down a little bit. Now I can erase my pencil lines, so I don't have any showing or getting smudged on my painting. And then I can start to detail with my next dark color for a bit of a shadow under the wings. And then for that center shaft of this large tail feather that sits on top of the rest. It's the one that's usually right in the middle, and the other tail feathers fan out in either direction from it. Then, just like how I did the wings, I can start to build up that darker gradient that's at the end of each of the feathers. A little bit more for that shadow under the ends of the wings. Then going back over these parts with another layer or two to build these darker colors up just a bit more. Now I've lightened that color up a little bit. And I want to use that to soften some of these brush marks that I have here from that previous color. I will do this quite often to merge two colors together, starting with a mid-range value as my base, then a shadow color, and then softly dry brushing a color that's in between those two to bring them together. Then a bit darker for just the ends, helping to make that gradient fairly strong. Then a bit more shadow under the wings, just trying to deepen that a little bit more. Now for some of that highlight color, again following that direction of the feather structure, pointing at an angle down and away from the center, building that color up, and just trying to keep it as soft as I can when it gets close to my darker color. For the other side, doing the same thing but now pointing in the other direction. And a little bit on the feather sticking out from underneath, and maybe a slight highlight on the edges. Now I can get my dark color for the shadows and base layer for the stripes. And I can darken that shadow under the wing feathers and a little bit on the sides. And darken that center part some more. Now I can start the stripes, giving these feathers that iconic blue jay look. And the one difference I noticed with the stripes on the tail is they start out about this size at the base and then get slightly thicker more towards the tip of the feather. It's not by much, but at least on the blue jay that I photographed, it was noticeable. So I'm going to try and paint these stripes slightly thicker as I get closer to the end of the tail. I think that looks pretty good. I can just go over a few of these again. And then for the stripes that are on the feathers sticking out from underneath, doing the same kind of thing and having them a bit thinner at the top. And then I can just go over a few of those again. Then with my black and Payne's gray mixture, I can go over them and darken some of these stripes. Mostly just the ones at the bottom, and a little bit less as I move into the highlighted area like how I had done on the wings before. And maybe just one more time, deepen that shadow under the wings just a little bit more. I'll grab some titanium white for the ends of these feathers here, and just paint in those white spots for my final highlight. I didn't quite like the edge of that feather on the side, so I just took some background color and cleaned it up just a little bit. Okay, I think the blue jay has come together really nicely. So just a few finishing touches here and there. Make sure my highlights are all nice and bright. And clean up a few edges. And I think that's looking really great. Now I want to quickly show you how I connect the branch that the blue jay is sitting on. If you want to see how I did all these frosty pine needles and snow, you can watch my previous video. I'll leave a link in the description below. So I'll just start with the base here to get the branch in the right place and with the right shape. And then I'm just going to cover up the end of this branch here because I decided to have the blue jay a bit higher in the painting than I had originally thought. Then for some darker color on the bottom of the branch for some shadow detail, and to start bringing in some contrast. A little bit lighter for the branches behind the blue jay, and a few pine needles that are on them as well. Just continuing to add more details and a little bit more contrast. Trying to get the texture of those branches right. A little bit more detail onto those pine needles. Then I can start to paint in the frost, starting with a lighter gray as my base color, and going over the pine needles and establishing that shape. And then with some titanium white, I can add the highlight for the frost. Just dabbing it on like this to try and create that fuzzy texture that the frost has. Building it up in a few layers and just bringing the whole scene together. So with the final few details, I think I can call this painting finished. I love how much this blue jay stands out in this painting. The bright blue feathers against all those frosty pine needles. I'm really happy with how this scene came together. So I appreciate you joining me as I brought this blue jay to life in this painting. Thank you so much for watching.